So what were the origins of the Vietnam anti-war movement? The movement didn't spring magically into existence upon the start of the American-led conventional war in Vietnam. It came together from a number of different directions involving leaders and activists who'd been involved in campaigns and causes prior to the decisions of the Johnson administration on Vietnam in 1964 and 1965. Indeed, the concept of a new left had emerged at the start of the 1960s in conscious distinction to the old left, which was seen as being kind of rooted in communist and socialist political groupings, in union activity and in theories of class conflict. The pioneers of the new left were, in the early 1960s, not very close readers of Karl Marx, although disputes about the kind of ideological contents of anti-war protest and the various kind of theories of Marxist revolution did become quite kind of heated in the later part of the decade. So the initial political programme of the New Left, as represented, for example, in the 1962 Port Huron Statement produced by the Students for a Democratic Society, that comes out of a meeting that they held at Port Huron in Michigan. That political programme was not obviously revolutionary. It reflected anxieties about nuclear war. It reflected a desire to end racial segregation in the American South. It reflected a belief in the power of grassroots action, or what they call participatory democracy, to effect change. But it also expressed a kind of suburban unease, a hope that through social and political engagement, activists might evade the costs, the sort of psychic costs, of a life of excessive ease and comfort upon their own sense of self. That is to say that the members of the New Left recognised that they'd grown up in comparatively fortunate circumstances, in conditions of material comfort, but that there was something rather artificial and hollow about just settling for a form of politics focused only on the goal of sustaining that comfort, when it could either be destroyed at the touch of a button through nuclear weapons, or was being denied to the vast majority of people around the globe. The aspiration to embrace opportunities for challenge and service also reflected very often religious backgrounds amongst members of the New Left. They'd grown up in a period of religious revival in the United States in the 1940s and 1950s. It also reflected the inspiring rhetoric of President John F. Kennedy in his inaugural address in 1961, asked not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And it also expressed an appreciation that the coming baby boom generation, that generation that was conceived as soldiers returned home after the Second World War, entering political maturity in 1964, was of such a size compared with the silent generation that it represented, if you like, the kind of pig in the python, a long kind of flat and then a really kind of big lump and then flat again, that would have considerable power to change attitudes, policies and institutions. As the name Students for a Democratic Society suggests, the New Left was strongly rooted in American university campuses, which were hugely significant to the development of the anti-war movement. Universities are lots of different things. Of course, they are places of intellectual exchange, where students can encounter new perspectives, learn new ideas, debate them with their peers. They're also nodes in a broader network, with organisations like SDS having chapters at campuses across the nation. Universities are very well connected with each other. And this allows students as well as staff to communicate and organise on a range of national and international issues. Universities were and still are sites of hierarchy and bureaucracy, which could offer a stimulus, a kind of gateway drug to involvement into oppositional politics, as at the University of California, Berkeley in 1964 and 1965, when students protested against the university's attempt to ban political activities, including the promotion of civil rights, on campus. And sort of involvement in those forms of local protest could seed out, as it were, into other forms of protest activity. And throughout the 1960s, the awareness that universities as institutions were deeply implicated in the Cold War. A lot of scientific research going on in universities is being conducted on the behalf of the Pentagon or other parts of the Cold War state. There were military training corps and military recruiters active on campus. That sort of sense that universities are implicated in the Cold War collided really kind of creatively with the vision of the university as a place of critical inquiry and consciousness raising. And finally, there's a kind of recognition that the university campus is also a site of exclusion, a kind of ivory tower removed from the real world. We can overemphasize that, but it's nevertheless this sense that the campus is uninviting to members of the working class or non-white ethnic groups. Sensitivity to the social and political provincialism of the university campus, indeed led many young white New Lefters to embrace the challenge of entering different, more bracing political arenas, enlisting, for example, with the Freedom Rides to desegregate bus terminals throughout the American South, or joining the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, to register African American voters in Mississippi. But over the course of the 1960s, that willingness to reach beyond the campus to form coalitions with other less privileged constituencies seemed to halt or wither. The growing perception amongst African American civil rights activists that white student activists were engaging in a form of kind of political paternalism, whilst being disconnected from the real understanding of Southern black communities, led to growing tensions within the civil rights movement between black and white activists, and helped to prevent sustained collaboration against the conflict in Vietnam, even while both groups were denouncing it as a racist war. And campus activists often failed to find a language that would allow them to engage successfully with working class constituencies in the vicinity of their campuses, with the result that their denunciations of the Vietnam War were widely regarded by such constituencies as indifferent to the fact that it was the poor and not middle-class students with their draft deferments or exemptions who were losing their lives in the conflict. Obviously, white students were not the only Americans protesting against the war. The first national protest against the Vietnam War in April 1965, organised in Washington, D.C. by SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, also featured members of the Old Left. It featured the occasional Quaker or cleric. It featured activists who'd previously participated in anti-nuclear rallies and protests and marches, and it also featured members of the civil rights movement. And in later years, the movement would stretch to encompass some dissident members of the political establishment, as well as disillusioned military veterans. But it was still predominantly student-led and reliant on students for attending its rallies. And that had an impact, for good and ill, upon everything it did, from the style of its rhetoric, from the nature of its calendar of events, through to its ability to establish a stable organisation and set a national strategy. Its leadership was diffuse, spread around various universities. It was subject to considerable churn as people stopped being students. It was occasionally prone to acts of cultural theatre, such as trying to levitate the Pentagon or nominating a pig named Pegasus the Immortal for president, as occurred in Chicago in 1968. These acts of cultural theatre only had a narrow constituency, and it meant that the movement was best placed to mobilise on a mass scale only during term time, when students were available on campus to be carried by bus to protests in other places.